your Spirit, that we might hear the word that you are speaking to the church for this time and this place, so that we will then live as your witnesses, testifying to your truth and your liberating love. To this end, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we are back in Luke's Gospel after being in Galatians last week. We're reading in chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Listen for what the Spirit is speaking to the church. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is one of those sermons where I simply could not come up with a title. Weeks ago when I chose the passage, and even this last week when I looked at the bulletin on Monday and Tuesday and finally said, just leave it blank, I don't have anything. And then in the Westminster in a Minute email, I came up with a title and decided that didn't work either. So now I want to just offer a simple statement and let that serve as the title, because I've come and then convinced that the thing that we ought to take from this is fairly simple and straightforward. It's this: we are all like the Pharisee, judgmental towards others, each in our own way. So on that happy note, let me begin by telling you a story of something that happened to me this past week. This week, I went out to Mercy Hospital to help some friends take their baby to a doctor's appointment. And as we came out, it was starting to just lightly drizzle. Not enough where you really needed an umbrella, but enough to know that it was about to rain. So I suggested that I bring the car up to the covering so that they could just get directly into the car with the baby. When I pulled up, I parked under the canopy, but I was on top of the crosswalk that was there at Building B at Mercy Hospital in the medical building. I put my blinkers on so as to say I wasn't just parking here out of my own convenience or arrogance. As they worked to get the baby in the car and I worked to get the stroller in the trunk, I hear these words: I hate you. I hate you. I was kind of shocked. And I looked up. And I saw a woman walking in front of my car, glaring at me with such venom. Horrified, I wanted to say, how can you hate me? You don't even know me yet. You can hate me after you know me, but you don't even know me. How can you hate me? She hated me, apparently, because I made her walk the distance of the pulpit out of her way, and possibly got a few spitting rain on her head. And this woman hated me. Now, it was clear that she probably couldn't see that they were busy putting a baby in the car, or that I had a stroller behind me. And I will admit, in those few moments, and probably for about the next 45 minutes, hour and a half, I made all sorts of judgments about this woman. And I condemned her as a judgmental person. You can laugh at the irony there. Why hadn't she taken the time to assess the situation before jumping to conclusions? Why couldn't she see I wasn't being selfish? I was doing a good deed. But she couldn't. And whatever was going on for her on that day, I will never know. She doesn't hate me. That much I'm clear. And she's obviously dealing with some serious stuff. So it wouldn't be fair for me to stand here on this day and condemn her. Because we have no idea what was going on in her life. Maybe she was facing significant pain. And those 3 feet really did make that kind of difference. I don't know. For her to say out loud what she did means that there's far more going on with her than we'll ever know. And honestly, she probably needs and will get our prayers on this day. But on Friday, as I've already said, for at least 30 minutes or more, I was really, really angry with her. I made all sorts of judgments in my head about who she was and her beliefs about the world and that sort of thing. And then I finally stopped. Because the truth was, I felt like I was a pretty good person. I would never do what she did. And then I was reminded, as I sat down that afternoon and looked at the scripture for today, that there's a point in this gospel story for all of us. By this point in the gospel, we're into the 18th chapter of Luke. We're heading for the home stretch. And throughout his ministry, Jesus has been full-scale challenging all of the religious leadership over all sorts of things, but primarily 3 things. And in this passage, he does all 3. The first one is self-righteousness. The second is contempt or rejection. And the third is humility and exclusion. Throughout Jesus' ministry, we know, and particularly in Luke, the religiously observant folk are always complaining about the inclusion of tax collectors and sinners. This fellow eats with and welcomes tax collectors and sinners. In fact, at some point, they grumble over John the Baptist's followers. The tax collectors, the sinners, the common people were going out to John the Baptist and following him and looking for ways to be more faithful to God's mission. And the Pharisees and other religious folks said, we want no part of it if they're included. They simply cannot imagine. They cannot imagine a world where God, the God that they know through the scriptures, would include those people. The simple message was you had to get right first, and then you would be acceptable to God. I know we've not heard that kind of theology today. In this passage, Jesus calls out the exclusion for what it really is: rejection and contempt for people not like us. People who don't think like we think, or act, or vote like we vote. And the contempt that they have for the tax collectors in the sinners is the very contempt, it's actually the same word, the contempt that they will pour upon Jesus when he's on the cross. Maybe there's a lesson there. Maybe, if we're not careful, when we allow our contempt to run unchecked, that it leads to death. Not always. But unchecked contempt has no place in the community of those who follow Jesus Christ or seek to do so. Contempt is toxic. And yet, that is exactly what Jesus is challenging here. And the history of the church seems to embrace contempt as a central tenet of our faith. To be acceptable before God, to create a community in which God would be pleased, the Pharisees became very good at excluding those who were not like them and did not follow the faith in the way they did. They knew how to exclude the tax collectors and sinners from their midst because they knew if they could get pure community, then God would finally be pleased. And yet, throughout his ministry, Jesus over and over again breaks this down, challenges it, openly defies it. And in this passage, Jesus moves from saying, you should be included, and he claims what is so offensive. I don't know if you caught this. I hope you did. He claims at the end of the passage that it's the tax collector who goes home righteous in the sight of God. Now, to people who had spent their entire life developing a tight-knit, well-developed theology of exclusion, to then say the excluded are the ones who are acceptable to God, you begin to get the offense that Jesus has created. The problem is, the religious leadership and other faithful folks have stopped asking how that could be the case. Instead of being self-reflective, they are just very good at following the rules. And as a result, they decide very quickly after this event that Jesus has to go. We have to kill him off. And this is what happens when judgmentalism runs its course. We lose our ability to be self-reflective. We are all judgmental. But being driven by our judgment is what it means to follow Jesus. We're all prejudiced in our own way. There are all sorts of things that we look at other folks and go, how on earth? But we don't often say it out loud. We probably give an air of silence or condescending look or something along those lines. But when we stop to have that moment to go, oh, that's what I'm doing, we become blinded like the Pharisees. Even if we don't see it that way. Some of you might be familiar with the translation of the Bible from Eugene Peterson, who is a Presbyterian minister, called The Message, some of which I like a whole lot, others I prefer the NRSV, but on this occasion I like what he has to say. He uses the beginning of the passage, this is what he said. Jesus, and I'm quoting, Jesus told this story to some who were complacently pleased with themselves over their moral performance and looked down their noses at the common people. Moral superiority isn't just about conservatism. And as I read and reread that passage with his interpretation, I thought it would really be easy to come in and just pick on the Pharisees, to pick on all those people who are exclusionary and judgmental because we aren't, and then we feel good, and then we become the Pharisees. Because here's the thing. We pride ourselves, Westminster prides ourselves on being welcoming and inclusion and accepting of all people. We don't demand the orthodoxy of people in this place. You want to follow Jesus? Come and join with us, and we'll figure it out on the way while we seek to bring about God's beloved community. We aren't folks who pride ourselves in fasting twice a week, or tithing, or our religious observances. We aren't the sort of folks who look to demonize whole groups of people for the world's ills. That's not who we are. We aren't interested in passing legislation to keep people out of our country. And we aren't interested in denying rights to people that we ourselves enjoy. So in comparison, we like to say we're not racists, we're not bigots, we're not misogynistic people, we're not hate-filled people who have been given quite a bullhorn these days. We're not like those folks. But it's not enough to say we're not like those. My dad used to say, I don't care what everyone else is doing. I care what you're up to. If the bar is really low, it doesn't mean if you barely pass it that you're doing well. Because if we only focus on the self-righteousness of religious people, we will miss how we, in our own thinking, have become self-righteous, or fall victims to its traps. If we simply point out the failings of religiously rigid folks, we haven't been faithful in our own discipleship. Jesus never says those religious observances in and of themselves are wrong. In fact, he says we ought to do those things, but then not turn around and beat other people up because they aren't. Saying, at least I'm not as bad as, I'm nothing like, can leave us to believe that somehow we're just a little bit better than those folks. But in our own minds, at some point, I would venture to say 99% of us might have said one of these things, at least inside, and possibly to one of our gossiping friends. We all have them. I have them too. So if you don't, I'd love to talk. I'd like to learn how not to do that. So here's some of the things we might say. At least I'm not as bad as. I'm nothing like. Can you believe someone would act that way? Can you believe what she said? Why on earth would he say that? Who does she think she is? How could someone dress that way? And I'm sure you could add to the list. As religious folks, it's already assumed that we're going to be judgmental and dismissive, and angry and hateful. That's what we have to fight against, to struggle against, to be that loving and living witness. Not to live and let live and anything goes, but to simply say, God has a different story, and it doesn't include exclusion. Like I said, simply not being like those who are worse than we are is not enough, because it leads us down the path of becoming exactly what we say we aren't. Back in 2014, Alicia Glenn wrote for Huffington Post and actually suggested 3, which I think are pretty good, ways at being less judgmental. And I think they make a lot of sense. The first one was, she said, nip it at the source. This makes a lot of sense. Everything starts with a seed, a thought. That thought in our mind might have come from our past experiences, where we were raised, who we grew up with, what high school we went to. Right? I know we don't do that, right? You think if someone went to high school and we already know everything about them. It happened in Indianapolis. It might not have happened here. It's up to us that when those thoughts come up, not just to bury them, but to root them out. To recognize that they may just be built on a very shaky foundation. And as she says, ask yourself, could there be more to the person or the situation that I see? Like the woman who walked in front of the car. I didn't tell you about another person who didn't say anything. When I first got out of the car, glared at me all the way around the car, until he got to the other side and noticed there was a little baby. His face changed to a smile, and you saw him literally go and walk inside. So her second proposal, after nipping those thoughts in the bud, the second one is to propose a counter thought. In other words, either a positive thought or a plausible explanation. And she provides this example. So, this is a woman with tattoos who's writing this, by the way. She may have tattoos to cover her scars or to commemorate the loss of someone she loved. By practicing this simple mind-mental game, we can find ourselves becoming less judgmental and stopping it before we act out of it. By not assuming that our initial thought is truth immediately, by questioning it, is this true? Is this in fact what's really going on? We practice this idea of self-reflection, of saying, oh, I notice these things. Is this really what's going on? And then the last one, which seems fairly simple, be open-minded. The truth is we're all creatures of comfort, she says. We do what comes naturally. And we don't, all of us, like to be in uncomfortable situations. So challenging our thought process can be uncomfortable, and it requires a level of open-mindedness. And this is why Jesus is, as we sometimes forget, poking his finger in those who are most rigid in their religious observances. He's not saying their religious observances are somehow wrong. What he's saying is what we've done with them. We need to be open to others' perspectives that might, in fact, challenge the very foundation of what we believe and understand the world to be. Imagine if we, who long to be welcome and inclusive, could first admit that we're not. There are people who are not welcome, not necessarily verbally, but in our thoughts, maybe even on our actions. If we can first admit these things, then we can work to root them out. And in doing so, we find ourselves to be more grace-filled because we figure out that we can offer grace to others that's been offered to us in the first place. We talk about being forgiven. And then we move to the passing of the peace, because those two things are tied together in the world. We've been forgiven, and we're called to offer that to others. And it is hard. It is deeply hard. And that is why again and again, week after week, we practice it in some small way. To be open to new ideas, to be open to new experiences, and to understand that despite us not being the conservative form of the Pharisees, that we run the risk of being the liberal Pharisee as well. And in it, we might take ourselves a little less seriously. And that is critically important. For it's those who cannot laugh at themselves that we have much to be fearful from. This is what Jesus calls us into a life of abundance. To be open, to be joy-filled and grace-filled with ourselves, and then grace-filled and joy-filled with all those who cross our path. Not everybody comes to the temple like the tax collector and the Pharisee in the same way. Even with that Pharisee, we have to somehow in the back of our minds be praying for him. Because we can be both, the tax collector and the Pharisee. And sometimes it just depends on our mood when we wake up. Amen.